But Carlos is someone that I really just took to heart when I first just learned about him in DC, and just looking at when eventually the baseball encyclopedia came out and I could look at his record, I said, God, why didn't he play longer? The guy could hit. Why didn't he play?
Well, I know it's one of the worst injustices of that time. He was such a great hitter, but again, a lot of it was his antics. A lot of it was
Right.
the overt racism. It was one of those things that he he wanted a particular style of game that he had back in the Cuban League, and he never felt all that comfortable here. But the reason he didn't feel that comfortable here is nobody helped him.
Yeah, that's the
So, I
key
mean,
thing.
if he'd had a mentor, or shoot, if they'd had the designated hitter, he might have been one of the greatest hitters of that era in so many different categories.
Right.
So it's one of those things that's tough. Now, I will say this: after his playing days in Major League Baseball, he did play in the Mexican League and he did play in the Cuban League. His baseball career went on and on. And later in life, he served as a mentor for a lot of players who eventually made it to the major leagues.
That's
So
so
he
cool.
was another guy that maybe he didn't make such a big splash himself as a player, but he did socially so many times after his playing days were over.
Yeah, that's really something. And the thing is, what you're mentioning, Jeffrey, is the fact that it still is going on as far as there's still this like tension, and sometimes you see these old time baseball players, announcers again, and sometimes just players in general, talking about the style of the Latino players because they flip their bats, how they run the bases, all of this. It's still that same, like, well, that's not the way baseball is played, in their opinion, their minds. And that's very unfair. That's very unfair.
Well, one of the things that is very telling is that for the St. Louis Cardinals right now, Yadier Molina is obviously on his way to the Hall of Fame career. Fantastic player from Puerto Rico. His brother Benji is the lead announcer for the Spanish Baseball Network.
Uh-huh.
So I'm going to tell you something. This is unbelievable. If you listen to the game broadcast by his brother Benji in Spanish, it's a totally different account of the game than what you're going to hear on Bally Sports Midwest, which broadcasts the Cardinals all across their network. And again, it's one of those things that's so unfortunate and it's unfair. But the account given by the Spanish network, and if you speak Spanish, you can listen to both. I
Right.
do, so I can listen to both. You get a totally different perspective of the game. So I don't know that you and I will see it in our lifetimes, but I just hope with all my might that before too long, there's going to be sort of a one game on the field that's fair for everybody rather than the divisions that are still out there.
I hope so. I think it may come about. Don't know when, but we will definitely see. But I want to talk about another person, because I don't want you to just talk about everyone in the book, because I want folks out there to buy this book. But I want you to talk about, speaking of the Cardinals, Thomas Alston, because he's someone I really didn't know about. Honestly, I'm glad I got your book because I didn't know that much about him.
Well, the story with Tom Molston is a very sad story. For most of the individuals in the book, we can say they had a profound influence on players and aspects of the game that came after him, but not so much with Tom Alston. Tom Alston was acquired by Gussie Busch, who was the owner of the Cardinals, because he really felt that it was time to add a person of color to the Cardinals. Now, I think he had a lot of financial motivation for doing this, as well as for social reasons. But he got Tom Alston from the Pacific Coast League, the minor league system out on the West Coast.
Right.
And Gussie Busch got fleeced. He paid $100,000 and 4 players to get Tom Alston, who was a first baseman, at a time when the Cardinals had Stan Musial playing first base and in the outfield as well. They didn't really need Tom Alston. They didn't need anybody else at first base. Didn't matter who it was. They didn't need a first baseman, but they got him. Okay, the thing with Alston was he came highly touted, but he had a hole in his swing the size of a Buick, and he had a heck of a time hitting major league pitching.
Right.
He had a hard time adjusting. Stan Musial actually took him under his wing and did the best he knew how to help mentor him. But the one thing the Cardinals didn't know was that Tom Alston had a lot of demons in his own right. He had some mental issues. He heard voices while he played. And part of it was he had a very abusive father growing up who always made him feel like he was never good enough. So he was tortured. Most people know the story, of players whose parents who were so domineering, the Jimmy Pearsall story.
Right.
And
Yeah,
Jimmy
fear
Pearsall
strikes out. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, Tom Alston had the exact same story. He really did. But he had all these I don't know what you call them, dreams, but he had them during the day. And while he was playing, constantly heard his father nagging him and jumping on him. And eventually it got to be too much for him. He tried to kill himself. He didn't succeed. He was found before he bled out. 1 year after the season was over, he went back to his hometown in North Carolina and burned down his church.
Oh man.
He had all these problems, but the thing was, nobody helped him. Now, if he had not been a person of color, would help have been provided? I've thought about this quite a lot, and possibly, but at that time, Major League Baseball didn't want anybody, race, color, creed, national origin, whatever. They didn't want anybody who had any mental difficulties to get a lot of publicity because they didn't want to tarnish the great quote unquote American game. So poor Tom Alston didn't get the help he needed. Gussie Busch, the owner of the Cardinals, kept him around 4 years after he was signed, hoping that he would get himself together and be able to play more, but he never did. He never did. He never got beyond the mental issues that kept him from realizing what potential he had.
And that's such a tragic story. But the other thing too that I didn't know, because I said I didn't know much about him, but I guess there's a plaque or statue in St. Louis now at the ballpark dedicated to him, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, Stan Musial gets a statue standing up. Tom Alston gets a plaque in the brick on the ground. And there is a plaque there. It's a bronze plaque, and it does talk about Tom Alston being the first person of color to play for the Cardinals. But they really haven't done a lot to talk about his history and heritage with the ball club. Some of it, no doubt, is because of the difficulties he had.
Right.
But I'm hoping this year they will do something. I had a pretty big book tour scheduled for this book, and I was going to go to the different stadiums representing the teams that are still there of the originals. And the Cardinals, one group. I even talked to the owner of the Cardinals about the book. But because of COVID, all the events have been canceled.
Oh man!
So I'm hoping that some of those get built up again. But I know the owners of the Cardinals right now are very interested in doing something to honor Tom Alston's place in the team's history.
But have you got in contact with his family? With the Cardinals, have they?
Through Tom Alston's family, you're talking about? Yeah, there aren't a lot of relatives left in Alston's family. That's the major problem. They did name a baseball field after him down where he grew up, but he doesn't get a lot of the publicity that he deserves for the groundbreaking he did, and that's really a shame. So I hope what I wrote in my book will at least make more and more people aware of what he did.
I think it will. Hmm.
I hope so. And speaking of that, I'm also in the Authors in Schools program, the national program. So when I can, I go out into the schools to visit with school kids about different books that I've written. This is my 36th book. So I talk to them about a lot of different things, but I've gone out and asked the students, like in junior high, so what do you know about Jackie Robinson? The last group I talked to, not a single kid in that class had heard of Jackie Robinson, not one.
Man.
And I was horrified. And I said, "You don't know who Jackie Robinson?" And one kid said to me, "What music does he do?" I know. And it figured, well, if I
Well,
brought him up, he
you
must.
know something. Up until about I know 20 years ago, there were players in Major League Baseball who didn't know who Jackie Robinson was.
Yeah, that's true.
You know,
That's
in fact, there was an
absolutely true.
article in some listeners. You may remember this publication, Sport Magazine. They did a story about that, and there were players who didn't know, and they went in particular to African American players who really didn't know who Jackie Robinson was. I don't think
Yeah,
that's the case
I
now.
remember that.
Yeah, I really don't think it's the case now, but
Oh,
you never
no,
know.
no. Yeah, well, Major League Baseball does commemorate Jackie Robinson's milestone every year.
Right,
It's not enough what they do, but at least they do it one day every year, and I think that gets a lot of publicity out there and people talking about the issue. But
right,
you're
and
right.
you're right, and your book is going to get people talking too, because it's really a great book. And I, before we conclude, I just want to ask you something you do at the end of the book, which I really appreciate. You get into the fact that some of the folks who are considered like the first African American player of the integrated team, it, that may not be the person. It may be somebody else. And talk about that. In particular, I'm thinking about the Phillies with Chico Fernandez versus John Kennedy.
Well, okay, in that case, I did get to speak with John Kennedy's children as I was doing the research for this book. And they said that John Kennedy never actually considered himself the groundbreaker for the Phillies. Chico Fernandez should have been, because Chico played 2 weeks in ball games before John Kennedy got on the field. John Kennedy played 5 games. His cumulative batting average was .000, never got a hit, made an error in the field. His fielding percentage is hideous. But Chico had a really nice major league career.
Yeah.
And now Chico Fernandez was from the same town as Carlos Paula. So how come Carlos Paula is considered the first for the Washington Senators and Chico is not considered for the Phillies? And there are other discrepancies too with the Pittsburgh Pirates.
Oh yeah.
Carlos Bernier is actually the first, not Kurt Roberts. Kurt Roberts, who is presented as a groundbreaker for the Pirates. Well, I did a little digging into that. Turns out Carlos Bernier played the whole season before, 1953, but he punched an umpire in the face during a game, got suspended, went into the stands with a baseball bat to beat up some fans, got suspended again, was horrible with his own teammates, picked fights all the time. So I asked somebody from Pittsburgh about this, one of the executives, and the person said, "We don't claim Carlos Bernier. He was not a nice person."
Oh
And
man.
I'm thinking, no, wait a minute here. We're not telling the truth here. He's the
I mean,
first.
it's not church. I mean, come on.
I know. I know.
Baseball. Come on, let's be real.
But there are a lot of those. Nino
Yeah.
Escalera was
Yeah.
actually the first for the Cincinnati Reds, not Chuck Harmon. Actually, Hank Thompson was not the first well, Hank Thompson was the first for both the Browns and the New York Giants,
Right.
but they've got Monty Irvin as first for the Giants, and that's not true.
No.
So what I did is I went with the list that Major League Baseball does, because I knew I wasn't going to be able to please everybody.
Right.
So
But you
if people have a problem with the 15 I have, they can go to Major League Baseball, and maybe that'll help correct some wrongs. Maybe.
oh yeah, but I think you've done such a great job with this book. You've done your research and everything. And I just really appreciate that you came on today. Now, what are you hoping to accomplish with the book? you've mentioned some things, but